Welcome to this joint Royal Society of Edinburgh and Campaign for Science and Engineering event. I'm the current president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My name is Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, and I'm going to be chairing this first, getting the show on the road, shall we say. So you're very, very welcome. Thank you for coming. So the format is I'm going to ask the director of CaSE, Dr. Sarah Main, to say a few words. We'll then have a presentation from Sheila Rowan, the Chief Scientific Advisor. Sheila will then be interviewed by Ken MacDonald here, and then there'll be a question and answer session, which I'll chair from here. Finally, a vote of thanks, and we're aiming to finish at about 7:20. That's the sort of plan. So could I call upon Dr. Sarah Main, the Director of CaSE, to say a few words?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Jocelyn for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here in Edinburgh among friends, some of whom I know well, and many of you I hope to get to know better. It's my belief that science, politics, and society are intertwined. During my time as a researcher, I didn't feel the hand of politics directly in the work that I did. I worked in cancer research, but I did notice its effects. For example, I noticed that cancer research was scientifically very interesting, it was quite widely studied, generously supported by the public and well funded. But you don't have to look too far down the lists of ailments that afflict human beings to notice that there's not necessarily a linear correlation between things which impact upon our health and the amount of support and funding they get. For example, at that time I noticed mental health was an example which was not enormously well funded, although later David Cameron set up a fund for an initiative on dementia which redressed that balance somewhat. But these observations just illustrate that the interests of scientists in the work that they wish to study, interests of society and the interests of politicians can impact upon what work is done. It's clear at the moment that politics and policies on science are diverging across the UK. CaSE wants to help science and engineering thrive across the whole of the UK by arguing for the skills, the funding and the policies that will ensure its success. So it is right that we should engage specifically and actively with science and politics in Scotland. CaSE has been providing a voice for science in politics for 30 years. It's our birthday this year. For some time, we've had strong representation from members in Scotland. We currently count 6 Scottish universities in our membership, as well as UK-wide organisations that have an active base here. I was particularly pleased when earlier this year the Royal Society of Edinburgh joined CaSE. And we embarked upon this venture of holding joint events in Scotland. I hope that our partnership will lead to a much more vibrant presence of CaSE in Scotland. The Royal Society of Edinburgh is an active player in influencing policy and politics in Westminster and Holyrood. We share many goals and ideals, and I have the greatest admiration for William Duncan and for his staff here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It is the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, however, that brings me to a halt. In fact, she brought me to a halt in my kitchen not that long ago. I was on maternity leave and my mum had bought me a subscription to Good Housekeeping magazine. I was a bit put out at this. I'm not really a magazine reader and I couldn't understand why she'd done it, but I was flipping through the pages of the magazine when who should I see next to the very familiar face of Nicole Kidman, but Jocelyn Bell-Burnell. She was having a chat with Nicole, as you do, because she was being awarded the Good Housekeeping Woman of the Year Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, I know Jocelyn has many honours to her name, but I consider this one to treasure, because there, on the glossy pages, was laid out her research in astronomy, her discovery of pulsars, her achievement as a scientific leader, an international ambassador, and her work to encourage girls and women into science, all in Britain's top-selling lifestyle magazine, with a circulation of 500,000, reaching an estimated 30 million people a month, many of whom, I'm guessing, don't regularly read about pulsars. So I feel privileged to share this stage with her, and I would like to salute her achievements in advancing science and championing science before one could take courses in such matters. And so to tonight's lecture. To my mind, the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor embodies the connection between science, politics, and society. CaSE has long believed that Chief Scientific Advisors play a vital role in ensuring scientific evidence is considered in government decisions, ensuring scientists are willing and able to contribute their expertise to policymaking, and ensuring the public is clearly informed about the balance of evidence on topical issues. I'm delighted that tonight we're able to hear from Scotland's newly appointed Chief Scientific Advisor. She will be interviewed, as you've heard, by the BBC's correspondent Ken MacDonald, and I'm looking forward to finding out about her professional journey to this role and how she hopes to deliver it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheila Rowan.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation to come and talk here tonight to both the Royal Society of Edinburgh and to CaSE. It's a pleasure to do so. And I look forward very much to hopefully giving you my perspective on the answer to that question. And we'll see over the evening how that goes and actually over the next few years. And I will actually touch, I think, on some of the things we've heard already this evening in terms of the themes of politics, in terms of society, in terms of the importance of explaining what scientists do to the public and really how important I think that absolutely is. And I wanted actually this evening not just to talk about the CSA role starting now, but to give you a little bit of perspective on how I have come to that role and what background, what scientific background I bring with me to that, because I think it does shape, again, my perspective on what's important in this kind of position. So to start with this evening, I'm going to tell you a little bit about science. So my perspective, where am I coming from in the field of science? Well, I'm still, in fact, 100% employed by the University of Glasgow. I'm seconded 3 days a week to this role as Chief Scientific Advisor. And in the other 4 days a week, I am still Director of the Institute for Gravitational Research there. That's an institute that was founded in 2000, was previously the Gravitational Waves Group, that has about 60 researchers in it, from academic staff to PhD students and undergraduates who work with us. And the mission of that institute has been gravitational wave astronomy. And again, many of you, I think, this year will have seen this come across your horizon. Our institute's focused on developing instruments to detect what are called gravitational waves, again, gravitational signals coming from far out in space, and has, again, with international colleagues this year, really opened up a new way to study the universe. So what are gravitational waves? Well, it's easy to write down the words. They're a prediction of Einstein's general theory of relativity, actually a prediction for which this is the 100th anniversary. There's a lot of mathematical formula in there, but fortunately we don't need to think about that at all. What relativity tells us is that the space we live in, the universe we live in, distances in it are changed. The universe is distorted. Space itself is distorted by the presence of mass. And as matter moves, as a star in this picture moves through space, or planets move through space, they curve the space around them. Matter curves space-time. And in turn, that curvature we can think of as gravity. And so any object experiencing that curved space feels a change in its motion. So matter curves space, and space-time guides the motion of matter. And the orbits that we think of as planets orbiting stars, you can think of, again, as them experiencing this curvature in space. And that's really what relativity tells us. So what are gravitational waves then? Well, if in this picture we've got a large amount of mass, very dense objects, dense stars out there in the universe, if they get caught in one another's orbit, they're changing the curvature of space. They are sending gravitational signals out through space. And as they pass by us here on Earth, as they come through the universe, come down, hit our galaxy, into the board here, they physically change the distances between points on the board there. We're all being stretched and compressed slightly as they come by. Stars colliding send out these gravitational signals. And why do we care about this? Why have we been trying to sense these effects? Highly exaggerated here. Turns out these are tiny effects. Well, this is gravity, not light we're sensing. It's a different kind of astronomy. It allows us to study objects far out in space that don't emit light of any kind. Objects like black holes. It's a way to study the dark universe, and that's a whole completely different kind of astronomy. And in fact, the first detections, again, were made actually late last year, announced in February this year, and what was detected were two black holes spiralling in to collide in a sort of cataclysmic collision far out in the universe, and we detected here on Earth the vibrations of space coming from those black holes colliding. And it was many firsts. First detection of these kinds of gravitational signals, the first direct detection, some would say, of black holes, certainly the first observation of black holes colliding in the 100th anniversary year of the theory of general relativity itself announced. So a whole lot of firsts, and again, a whole lot of new science. Again, we could tell, for instance, this happened 1.3 billion light years away out there in the universe. A light year being the distance that light travels in a year. So 1.3 billion years ago, this collision happened. Round about the time that multicellular life was kind of developing here on Earth, again, we had some evolution to go through to get to the point of building our detectors just in time for this signal to arrive. Again, but phenomenal new way to do astronomy. And again, my group in Glasgow worked on the hardware for that, building instruments to sense these tiny distortions in space, building large instruments, working in partnership with colleagues in the US, where these new gravitational observatories, the LIGO instruments, are located, working with US colleagues, German, Australian colleagues, and actually many international colleagues around the globe to do this. The detection, this new astronomy, could not have been done without nations working together in partnership across national boundaries. It could not have been possible otherwise. And it's a rich source, because of the technology developments needed, of spin-offs. And these are actually all spin-offs, again, from work, again, done in Scotland, working with Scottish companies to take advantage of that. So working with Span Optic, now Gooch and Housego in Fife, on looking at bonding optical materials spinning out of this work. I'm working with Heliophotonics here in Scotland on optical coatings, again, of the mirrors of these instruments, characterising the damage threshold. In the healthcare sector, working with Optos to take the data analysis techniques and improve the quality control of their machines for scanning retinas and looking for medical issues. I'm working with colleagues at the University of the West of Scotland on techniques to control how stem cells turn into bone, to help people with after orthopaedic surgery, blast injuries. Working with Historic Scotland to study how sandstone weathers on historic buildings, and again on miniature gravity sensors with a whole variety of applications with Quantic here in Glasgow and companies here in Scotland and across the UK. And so it's a spectrum of interests that covers fundamental science, technology development, and how that helps society and the economy. And so that's the background that I come from, which I have to say also, what was incredibly exciting was to see the impression that this discovery made on the public and how it caught the public imagination for science, for discovery, for studying our universe. And these are just a selection. There were many, many more of the global front pages that, again, picked up what was a universally good news science story. There were no disasters. This was fundamentally good news. Again, that really did, there are languages here that I recognise and some that I am actually not sure about. It really was a global story that involved over 1,000 scientists in international collaborations from around 14 countries working together. And again, very exciting, a fantastic catching of the public imagination and trying to explain the science we've been doing, but you can't please everyone. And actually, this was sent to me by one of the senior people in my funding agency who came across this. And you can see a huge black hole opened yesterday in the public's understanding of what the latest scientific breakthrough was all about. No light was shed at all by a huge, dense mass of newsprint that collapsed in on itself as it attempted to explain the importance of gravitation. The amount the public understood was so microscopically small, at first instruments couldn't detect it, but after a while, the comprehension level was less than a billionth of an atom. Said one hurt astrophysicist, this could be the most significant lack of understanding, since it's the last thing the public didn't understand. However, in this case at least, a member of the public was quick to congratulate the scientific community. Look, we're very happy that they're happy. I'm sure it was, great, and it'll help us defeat the Klingons and destroy the Death Star. Anyway, jolly good. So it's a salutary lesson that we try very hard to explain the importance of the science that we do and get that across and be inspirational, but try and make sure that we get the message out of the importance of what we're doing. And it is really important that we succeed, exceedingly important that we succeed. And I think over the last year, over the last months, it's become increasingly clear that this is a very important thing for scientists to do. We must do this and really get across the importance of what we do. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. What does a chief scientific advisor then actually do? And it's a different answer, I think, for chief scientific advisors in different countries and perhaps in different government departments in the UK. So I will talk from the perspective of the chief scientific advisor to the Scottish Government. And it covers, I think, a range of important areas. Again, as we've already covered earlier this evening, one of the key things, one of the core parts of the role is to make sure that ministers and policy officials in government have access to independent scientific advice for policy on issues of strategic importance. Also, to champion the role of science, and again, we heard about that in the introduction too, to make sure people understand its importance to the economy and how it genuinely can improve the well-being of the country, stakeholders, of the population. So as a Scottish CSA then, again, another part of that role is to represent and advocate for Scottish science, both here in Scotland, in the UK, in Whitehall, more broadly in Europe, importantly at the moment, and also internationally. And lastly, touching on inspiration, we cannot have a healthy science base. We cannot reap the benefits of what science can do for the economy without having a pipeline of scientists coming along, again, maximising the capabilities that we have to harness science right across the full breadth of diversity in the country. And so these kind of fall into three areas, again, science for policy, policy for science, and science for society. And so, again, I'll talk a little bit briefly about each of those. So policy for science, you can see here the smiling faces of, again, Shirley-Ann Somerville, Minister for Science, Higher and Further Education, our Deputy First Minister and First Minister. And it is exceedingly important, again, core role, that officials and ministers know about scientific developments and how they may affect policy creation and delivery. Policy for science. And it's important to have people in the system who will champion the use of science as part of that evidence base. And that's a critical thing. And it's important, though, it's critically important, I think, that evidence base is there, that science is recognised as a core part of that evidence base. But it's, of course, not the only part. And I think it's also important and realistic to realise, and again, it seems obvious to us that science is important, but it has to sit alongside the other factors that go in to inform policy. And that's got to be including things like social and cultural licence, what people are willing to see enacted, economic evidence, affordability. All of these things Values, again, are incredibly important in developing policy, but again, what a CSA can, must, and I think should do is make sure that science is one of the core evidence pieces that goes in alongside policy. As well as maintaining a challenge function, being willing to look at how policy is developed, face up to, in some cases, sort of the issues associated with policy development. Now, no one person clearly can give all the advice across the breadth of areas that's needed. No scientist can do that. So it's got to be part of a process where there's a range of sources inside government and external government who can be accessed to provide that scientific advice. And again, it's important to remember that science, sometimes people put it in a box. They have very specific ideas about what science is. They think they can contain it and that it's something they don't need to worry about. It's test tubes and white coats. It's broader than that, much broader than that, in my opinion, and again, it covers a spectrum of government policies, some of which, again, are perhaps not obvious in terms of how scientific advice can go in. And I think it's exceedingly important, again, as a scientist, it seems obvious to us that we should base our decisions on scientific evidence, but we should not take this for granted in any way. And again, today's Guardian, in fact, again, has I stole this from their website there, a very interesting article, The Cult of the Expert and How It Collapsed. Again, we cannot take for granted that the use of this kind of expert advice, external advice, scientific advice is always going to be supported and accepted. Again, it's where the importance of explaining to people the relevance of science, of having acceptance of what we do and recognising the importance of it is so exceedingly important. So, sources of scientific advice. Well, again, there's a sort of overarching role for the Chief Scientific Advisor, for me, but the Scottish Government, of course, has another two, again, Chief Scientific Advisors, Louise Heathwaite, again, with specific portfolios, Louise in the area of rural affairs, food and the environment, and Andrew Morris, who's pictured as here, and again, I think Andrew's here in the audience tonight, as Chief Scientist for Health, again with very, very specific remits in those particular areas. But of course there are cross-cutting areas that actually can involve evidence across both these areas and wider. Again, so it's a network of advisors that works together, along with, again, a cadre of scientists and engineers inside government who are employed by government. Again, in Scotland, that's often in the area of agriculture and marine areas, because for our country, those are very important areas that Scotland has specific needs in. So having scientists within government carrying out research specifically relevant to government policy is highly important. There are also more arm's length bodies, again, that receive government funding, but again are a step removed, as well as the wealth of higher education that we have in Scotland to access advice from in the rest of the UK, and expert advice from overseas where necessary. And an important part of that spectrum is, of course, the Scottish Science Advisory Council. Again, and I know we have previous members of that here tonight, and potentially previous chairs, to provide, again, an independent body with a breadth of advice, again, of expertise that can be accessed by the Scottish Government in different areas again, particularly, I think, for horizon scanning, to bring out areas that actually the government may not have realised it should be taking advice in, to bring to its attention important developments. So this is a broad spectrum, and it's necessarily broad because, as I said, I think scientific advice covers a huge range of areas, including things like justice, again, making sure that we understand the research that's done into best practice in the courts, in the justice areas, the environment, security, the economy. So it's a wide range of areas for which science advice is relevant. For a healthy system, of course, it needs good policy to support science, and that's, again, an area of interest for this role, which includes, of course, funding for higher education and research, support for innovation, again, translating those benefits into the economy. And again, I was appointed, I think, 13th June. A couple of weeks later, of course, there was a referendum the outcome of which resulted in a change to the landscape, actually, that we all sit in and we all operate in, and specific concerns for the science sector, science being the broad there. So a role that I quickly had to do, and I think it's a useful role for the CSA and an important role, is to act as a conduit between the government and the external science community. And so one of the first things I did in the first few weeks after this was pick up the phone to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, to the Royal Society, to colleagues leading pools in Scotland, science pools between the universities, to talk to them about their concerns and make sure that those voices were fed back into government so that which of course they were receiving from other sectors and through other channels, but via the CSA is I think also a useful route to be able to feed in what's happening in the sector and what its concerns are, which is not just, of course, the academic community, but the business community, industry, the breadth of interest there. Conversely, again, representing Scottish science interests, again, both in the UK and internationally, well, in the UK, there is a network of chief scientific advisors. Each of the government departments in the UK government has its own advisor, and again, so there's a network chaired by Mark Walport as the UK CSA, again, which meets sort of informally when available roughly once a week. There's always an invitation to the Scottish CSA and the Welsh CSA, Julie Williams, and once a week it's in London, so once a week's hard to attend that frequently, but again I attend approximately once a month, again to make sure that I'm talking to my colleagues in the UK government, understanding what's happening there, what thoughts are there, and I am always made exceedingly welcome in that arena. Again, they're very pleased to have the Scottish CSA there to talk to, again as another conduit of information, again from between the administrations. Internationally, again, in the last few weeks, again I've talked to colleagues in Europe, again where again there's a very specific Scottish perspective, I think, that we have in terms of science, in terms of the outcome of the referendum, in terms of sending out that message of continued engagement and the importance of that for Scottish science. Merging in then from policy for science to science for society, again I've talked again a little bit about where I come from in that perspective. Science interests in Scotland are broad, and industry is a key part of that, of the science sector in Scotland. And in fact, last night I had the pleasure of attending the annual meeting of the Scottish Optoelectronics Association. Again, it happens to be a part of the sector here, again, that I historically have known quite well. Scotland's well known for that. But we are fortunate, in fact, to have expertise across a wide range of areas. The innovation centres, again, that we have from digital health, oil and gas, industrial biotech, show that. Interacting between industry and our universities and the size of the country actually makes that, again, a very powerful interaction to have. Again, as within the UK CSA network, I have just agreed to act as champion for quantum technologies at a UK level, again, so Scottish CSA, but taking on that responsibility. And to feed this, in Scotland, people are the most important resource that we have. We have these fantastic institutions. We have, again, the opportunity to have excellence, again, across ranges of research and science and translating that into industry. But we need the pipeline of people coming through to make sure that that is maintained. So science for society is where, again, the inspiration and the engagement part, again, is incredibly important. That job in explaining to people what we do, communicating the excitement of science. Not everyone who goes into science is going to be an academic researcher, nor should we want them to be for the health of the country and for the health of the economy. But we should want them to be excited about science and to be engaged with science. And that's incredibly important. So another thing, again, as CSA that I've done in the short period since my appointment, is start to work again with Shirley-Anne Somerville, again with ministers, colleagues in the Scottish Government, on a STEM strategy, particularly aimed at education and training for young people. And to get them in, we have to make sure they're engaged, so public engagement with science, again, through the range of outreach activities, again, partly supported by the Scottish Government, is incredibly important. So, to sum up then, what good is a Chief Scientific Advisor? Well, again, I hope, again, over the next few years, to work with the government to make sure it has access to the best science advice it can get from its network of advisors, from the external bodies and internal scientists in government who can contribute to that. Also to make sure that the science sector broadly, including industry, has a voice to represent its concerns to government, that government understands, again, the sector and its worries. And again, to make sure that we do our best to communicate, again, the importance of science, how it contributes to the country, again, and to see the impact, again, across a whole range of areas, right from fundamental numeracy and digital skills that are just essential for people now to succeed, to make sure that that happens. Remembering, and again from personal experience, it's absolutely clear to me that science in Scotland sits in an international context. Science doesn't respect borders. To make the advancements in science that we need to make, we have to look outwards and work internationally. So, again, as it says here, at the end of my 3-year secondment, I hope to have a positive impact in these areas and to convince, again, the public, you here tonight, the government, that they will see the good of having a Chief Scientific Advisor. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming tonight as well. Just can I say how gratifying it is to see so many people who care about science, and maybe we should talk about that in a minute and how we can get more people to talk about it. My name's Ken MacDonald. I'm science correspondent of BBC Scotland, and if you put all the science correspondents in Scotland into one room, there'd still be only me, which is another thing we could maybe talk about as well, about public understanding. But it struck me that you've made it clear there that what good is a Chief Scientific Advisor? Well, your point is to do good, to advise, to champion, to advocate, to inspire. 3 days a week for 3 years. Yes. How are you going to do that?
Well, again, I think one of I spent at least 2 slides talking about the fact it's not only me. Again, there's a whole spectrum of people involved in that process. Again, in the science advice sector, again, Andrew's here tonight, and Louise also. Again, there's also Catherine Calderwood, Chief Medical Officer. So it's not about me personally having to deliver all of that, but hopefully, helping put together a strategy, think strategically about that, about where best that can contribute, and work with my colleagues, again, and scientists in government, to contribute to that. So it's not about necessarily me delivering it all, but helping in the delivery of it all, helping shape that.
There's been a big push for evidence-based policy. I don't know how many times I've read the Geek Manifesto, for example, and it seems like a wonderful idea until you realise that politicians work in the short term. They work in, well, slightly longer term than you, 4 or 5 year cycles, where they have to get re-elected. Is there a fundamental clash between evidence and what, for all their faults, the opinion polls say? I think
that's something in which the people can hold politicians to account. And again, in which we have to be clear about that there are, I think, competing sometimes inputs to policy development. I think what's important is that we're clear about what they are. We should be clear what the scientific evidence is that's feeding into policy, what that contributes. We should be clear what the other constraints are, if they're affordability constraints, if there are other sort of value-based constraints. I think what's important is that it's clear and understood what the situation is. Again, ministers are elected officials. They're the people who have to make the policy decisions. I think what we can do and should do is make sure that they have the best basis on which to make those decisions. And I say we should not take for granted even that that evidence will naturally go in or be sought. You know, we have to make sure that that's the case.
That's an interesting point. When you are offering evidence, do you offer evidence or do you wait until you're asked?
Oh, I think I'm certainly happy to offer evidence again, and again, one of the things that I've done again in the time that I've been in post is talk to people across Scottish Government in different areas to understand what the interests are in policy development, what the issues are for government that it's going to look at, it's thinking about policy in, to volunteer the help that could be provided from the Science Advisory System, from the CSE's office. And in some cases, again, I think it's interesting, there's a recognition of wanting to understand what the evidence is, but again, in some areas, not actually thinking of it as scientific advice. As I say, that's so I think that actually has been, I'm more than happy to both respond to requests and in some cases where I see an opportunity to volunteer that the advisory system could help and could feed into that.
Because as you said, you want to champion Scottish science within the Scottish Government. You want to be an advocate for it. So that would imply that you do have to be proactive. If you pick something up in the field, you're going to have to push that onto ministers. Well,
I think it's important. I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's one I think Peter Gluckman has written about, the question of brokerage and advocacy. And you have to be, I think, you have to broker information. You have to be quite clear that you're not advocating specific sort of necessarily courses, but that's making sure that independent advice goes in. But that's, I think, different than advocating for the use of advice, again, and that I think is important.
I should say, please excuse me if you catch me looking at my watch. It's not because I'll be getting bored. It's because I'm very conscious of the fact that about 7 o'clock, maybe slightly before, we're expecting you to come up with your questions, so I hope you're cooking them up. Otherwise, Dame Jocelyn is going to be left at a bit of a loose end because she's chairing that session. So please, if particularly if you think, why didn't he ask that, you can ask it instead. There was, Sheila, a gap between Muffy Calder, who was the second Scottish Chief Scientific Advisor, stepping down, and your appointment. It was about 18 months. Now, I'm prepared to accept that it wasn't entirely the Scottish Civil Service's fault, not least because my wife's a Scottish civil servant, so I have to. But there is a sense that, well, what did Scotland miss in those 18 months?
So, again, we should be clear, I think, one, the government did actually go through an appointment round, but just, again, eventually an appointment wasn't made. And also there was there was no advice in that time. As I say, we saw, again, the faces of Andrew and Louise who were there, the other parts of that system. But I think what it missed was, again, that overarching role to advocate for the use of science, to have someone who felt it's their responsibility to do that across that broad level. And also, again, I think specifically for the science community, for the outside, to feel there was recognisably someone there. Again, as you can see after the referendum, I think it was useful to have someone in post, again, who for the outside could be a conduit, who could perform that role and perform that linkage, for instance, with the CSE network down south, and again, that I think is an important role. So, I mean, so whilst it wasn't that there was a complete void in scientific advice, I think the CSE role has different aspects, I think, that are important to have in place.
Do you think enough people beyond this room, out there in the real world tonight, in real Scotland, actually understand how science works and what it is for?
That's a good question. Again, I think it's one that we as a community have to take very seriously, and that's why I, again, highlighted the article in today's Guardian, and there's been a lot of discussion about that, again, in the press over the last while, not just science, but more broadly. And I think actually the area of public understanding of science is one in which I've seen, in I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years, a large change in the attitude of scientists towards it. I think, you know, for a long time, it was something that kind of people did on the edges. but didn't really see as a core part of the role. I think there's a greater understanding now amongst the scientific community that that should be a core part of the role and a really important part, again, that things will fall apart if we don't take seriously our responsibility to get across that message. And it's not just a question of making sure that the funding for science is there. It's a much more integrated question of how society works, how policies developed to make sure that broadly we do our best to get across that message. I think we clearly still could do better.
I think there's a tendency in the media in particular and in society in a wider sense that science is sometimes put over in a box, that people are expected to know about football a bit and politics and have an opinion about this or that, about current affairs and so on. But when it comes to science, we don't need to know about that. Scientists will know about that.
And I think, again, it is. I think you're right, and we have to be careful how we talk about science. Again, and one of the ways I like to think about it is that evidence question in the context of scientific advice to government. Again, I think there can be a tendency, as I said, to put science in a box and think there are areas where scientific advice is relevant, but actually it's the rigour of scientific method and research, including social science, again, very, very broadly. And so I think it is important that we think about our language when we talk about science and highlight how integrated that is into everything we do. Again, that from mobile phones to the internet to everything we kind of take for granted, that science isn't something divorced from everyday life, from healthcare. You know, it really is everywhere.
There's also, though, an argument to be made for blue sky science. When people, you put up a lovely slide showing you all the spin-offs from gravitational wave research, including the one that I particularly like, which is nano-kicking, which is when you move the stem cells by a very precise distance and at a very precise frequency, and it creates bone, which is wonderful. And it also shows you how creative science is.
Yes.
But I'm not sure we're going to find a use for a Higgs boson within the next 500 years. I could be wrong. That's still important. How do you get that across?
I think again, it's sometimes in various ways. Again, I'll give you an example, and by example is often a good one. I talked about relativity, Einstein's special theory and general theory of relativity. Again, we're in the 100th anniversary. Again, I think back when Einstein was doing those calculations, not only were they very difficult to understand, but they described effects that on the whole you don't see in everyday life. You know, so what relevance could they possibly have? But without special relativity and general relativity, the global positioning system that is, you know, underlies $1 billion contribution, I mean multi-billion-dollar contribution to the global economy, simply would not work. But that wasn't applied research. You know, who knew what application that you know, those things we're going to have. So I'll take your bet on the Higgs boson. I might not be here in 500 years to collect, but
perhaps I was being a bit pessimistic about 500 years.
We simply don't know. That is the again, there's a quote I've used many times and I'll use it again, I think, from George Bernard Shaw, who says, progress is made by the unreasonable man. I like to think he meant the unreasonable man or woman. But it's the fact, and why? Because the reasonable person adjust themselves to the world they find themselves in, whereas the unreasonable person insists that the world change to get done what they want to do. And experiments like the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, like LIGO, I didn't talk again about the details, but again, phenomenally difficult experiments to do that required people to invent technologies along the way to make those experiments work for no other reason than to do the fundamental research. That's how progress is made, is by pushing the unreasonable, difficult, fundamental things that people want to study.
You mentioned the unreasonable man or woman, and we have to note that the 3 chief scientific advisors so far have all been women. It's unfair, isn't it, to expect you... No, I didn't mean it that way. It's unfair to expect you to be a standard bearer for women in science, or is it? Do you want to do that as well?
I think actually, well, again, we should first of all give credit to Professor Wilson Sibbott, who I think is here this evening, yes, who was a precursor to the Chief Scientific Advisor. So, but I think it actually is very it's, I think, terrific for Scottish science that there have been 3 female CSEs from very different areas, again with Anne Glover on the biological side, from Muffy in computing science, and from me in physics. I mean, how I think it's unavoidable. I think that that's a terrific set of examples of role models, you know, to show the normalcy of having women as chief scientific advisors, and Louise Heathwaite, of course, as for rural affairs and the environment. So I think I'm quite happy to be in that position. Again, I think it's important to indicate the normalcy of it, and more than happy to perform that role.
The trouble is, it isn't normal yet, is it? There's a terrible attrition rate
Sure.
between undergraduate and professor.
It's certainly an unsolved issue. It's how to improve from the position that we're in terms of engagement in science for young women. It's incredibly important. Again, the RSE produced a report a few years ago now of tapping all our talents, which pretty much explains in its title what the issue is. Again, we've got to harness all the capabilities we have, and it's not an easy thing to solve, and it requires action, again in my opinion, throughout the various stages of the system, from primary school onwards, right through school, secondary school, and in universities. And I mean, this is also true of industry. I'm afraid at the meeting I was at last night of the optoelectronics community, there are fewer women there than there are actually in many other spheres. So it's industry too. It requires action at all those levels. It's not easy to solve. It requires cultural change, recognition of the unconscious biases that do exist. Again, no matter how much people think they're unbiased, we all carry with us those unconscious biases. I think the recent efforts at the university level to engage with the Athena Swan certification programme, I think are exceedingly important. And again, just first of all, getting people to recognise the issue, think about it in their organisation, again, is the first place to start. The STEM strategy, again, that I mentioned, again, I know the Minister is very recognises this as a really important area, and so it's one, again, that we'll try and look at there.
You talk about unconscious biases. I was telling a colleague earlier today, a female colleague, that I was going to meet the Chief Scientific Advisor, and she said, "Oh, what's his name?" And that's, you know, it's like people still expect doctors to be men,
yes,
and nurses to be women. Yeah, that sort of thing, which is good. They've got to take a generation or two to overturn.
Well, let's hope we can speed things up a bit.
If anybody can, yes. I wanted to ask you though, but there are obviously hot button issues that run-of-the-mill journalists might ask you about, like fracking and GM crops. But I'm not really going to ask you about them tonight because I know you're not going to tell me yet. But what sorts of processes will you have to go through? What sorts of judgments will you, or how will you arrive at the judgments, which you then offer to ministers to say fracking, good thing, bad thing, or perhaps somewhere in between, for example?
So I think in all those areas, what's important, again, is to do the best job and get in one, so GM's an area where science has moved on, science moves quite rapidly. So making sure, and again, Louise, I know, is doing this, that the latest evidence in that area is available, that is there, fed into the system, and is also translated. Again, it's this incredibly important question of not just being able to explain to the public the scientific concepts, but being able to, for everyone, put into that recognisable language what are sometimes complicated issues, make sure that translational piece is done in explaining the scientific concepts. So I think that's an ongoing process. It's one that it's important the advisory system does, is make sure that, again, where there are relevant areas, difficult areas sometimes, evidence is the most up-to-date state of evidence in those areas is brought into government, is collated and made available and kept on the table.
And let's say, theoretically, let's not say it's GM or fracking for that matter, but let's say you advise ministers and say this is a good thing, and they decide against it. Will you tell the public that you gave the opposite advice to ministers? Because you are a public servant as well?
It's an interesting question. And again, it's why, it depends how the advisory system is structured, how that advice is taken in. And that's something I want to look specifically at, is the mechanisms by which advice is taken. But again, in many of these cases, advice will be taken, that advice is made public and consulted on, and then synthesised into some advice. And transparency, I think, is an important part of the process. Occasionally, I suspect there are occasions where some frank advice might want to be given that you don't necessarily want to make public. But I think transparency is important, the transparency of evidence gathering, the processes that go into providing that advice, I think, is important. I think it is important, though, also to bear in mind that it's one of the factors that goes in. Scientific evidence is one of those things. We have to remember that. And
let's go away from the hypotheticals now, but nevertheless, when you're in the situation you are no longer a scientist, really. You're still partly a scientist. You're also in the political realm. We've seen what happened to Anne Glover when she dared to take a position on GM, the position that science suggested was the correct position on GM. And she was, when she was European Chief Scientific Advisor, she was not quite burned in effigy, but I think people were looking for their pitchforks and burning brands in some sectors, weren't they? Are you ready for that?
We'll just have to see. Again, I feel like I'm being interviewed for my post all over again. I feel what's important is to be happy as a scientist and comfortable with, again, that one has followed, a correct and reasonable process and path, and is happy with the ethics of that. And then, again, it turns out you can't please all of the people all of the time, and so you just have to be prepared to explain what you've done, why you've come to the conclusions you have, and have a discussion about that.
You've spoken about how you're going to operate in the UK context, which is not to go to every breakfast meeting that Walport has, but maybe 1 in 4, which is making the voice heard across the United Kingdom. But is there an advantage in Scotland having distinctive institutions and being this size? I'm very conscious of the fact we have a representative of the Estonian Academy of Sciences here tonight, which is a smaller population even than us. And one of the advantages, presumably, is you can be more cross-cutting in a government our size than in Whitehall.
I think that's true, and I think it's actually true that Scotland's size is an advantage, actually, across a range of different scales of things you might want to do. So, in other words, the distance between people in different parts, not only of the government, but the sort of industry, the educational system, how universities can work together. We've already seen that in the pooling arrangements in science in Scotland. And there are actually things you can do because that you can be agile on because of the size of the country that are actually possible to do in terms of thinking about big data. Again, that Scotland forms a unit that has systems that are integrated in such a way that actually is not necessarily the case across the UK. So I think it's something that's it actually is potentially an important advantage in some areas that we can take advantage of, is the size, both in personal interactions and actually in some ways in scientific areas.
Now, one last question for me before we unleash your intellects far superior to mine. But Brexit, you mentioned it, so in a Basil Fawlty style, you mentioned it once, but I think you got away with it. Let me ask you about it again. Some people seem to be presenting it as it's either going to be an apocalypse or just a disaster. But is there a sense that, well, are you optimistic of the future of Scottish science, whatever might happen? Because we don't know what Brexit means yet, apart from Brexit.
Yes. I think, so for Scottish science, I think clearly we don't know where we're going to end up in the process. And that uncertainty is difficult. Again, I think what we should be clear about are several things. We should be clear about the current situation, the benefits that we have from our European participation in terms not only of funding, although funding is important, but it's not the only thing. I talked about again, the fact that some of the breakthroughs cannot be made without international collaboration, and the influence in terms of working in partnership, steering how a larger body, the European body in this case, can behave, can act, what the future is going to be. So that influence is important. And then people, again, we are phenomenally lucky in the international, European and international, but non-UK European scientists that we have here in Scotland. They contribute enormously to the intellectual life of Scotland, to us. So what I think we are where we are. We don't know where we're going to go. We've got to be clear on the benefits we have, and throughout the next period of negotiation, whatever happens, whatever paths are taken, again, understand and try and be agile in terms of how we can try to influence the way ahead to retain those benefits. Again, I know we had a chat earlier, and again, I think it's true that scientists are robust. Again, if you present, research councils change their funding rules all the time. Scientists read them carefully and respond to them. Again, no matter what the rules are, the scientific community will work to do its best to get science done within those constraints. Again, but of course, it takes energy and effort to do that. So there's going to be a period in which we as scientists have to, again, look carefully at what's happening, think about the consequences, try and do the best we can to optimise the outcome to get done the science that we want to get done.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Rowan. I don't see why you shouldn't give her another round of applause. Well, Dame Jocelyn, we've got...
Ken's escaping. You're assuming there are no questions to you, Ken. There is now opportunity for questions, comments to, shall we say, anybody who has been or is on the platform, but primarily Sheila. If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, wait for a microphone to come, and please hold it fairly close to your mouth so as we can hear you. Let's start at the back, please. Thanks, Erin.
Hi there. So, I'm thinking back to fairly recently when a certain odious individual said the British public are tired of experts. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think there is an active hostility to expert or scientific advice? And do you think there's any routes or specific actions that you or the wider scientific community can take to combat that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we do have, I think that pushback, I think, can be real. Again, we have to be very careful that we, and it's why it's so important that we try and explain the relevance of what we do in the broadest possible terms, that we don't take a position of being, outside, sending wisdom down. I mean, that we actually work hard to engage and explain what we do. And I hope that we can do something about that, again, in terms of, it's not something that I'm going to solve, but it's something as a community, as a science community, I think we have to take very seriously and think about in terms of our language, in terms of our behaviours, in terms of the talks that we give. Again, many of my colleagues give public talks, and sometimes that's a pretty self-selecting audience that comes along. So we have to think about ways to engage more broadly, again, in what we do. Through social media, through different ways of engaging to get the message out there, and think very carefully about how we do that. I think it is a real issue.
Erin, right at the back on your side.
Hi, actually you partially answered my question just now. I work in a museum, and I was delighted that you included science engagement so firmly within your role. I just wondered if you'd expand on that as to what mechanisms you think are most effective, and you just covered some of them, and how the science advisors can support that.
So I think the mechanism depends a lot on the audience that you want to reach. And it's very audience dependent, and we need to use a whole spectrum of techniques and ways to get across. And I've heard some fantastic imaginative ways. We have science festivals, but why not have attendance at book festivals food festivals, engaging the audiences who don't necessarily come along to the science festivals. Again, I know the science centres do terrific work, again, in going out to communities who are not, for whatever reason, going to come into science centres. Communities who would find it really difficult to do that, whether it's for financial reasons, cultural reasons, thinking imaginatively about going out to people, again, reaching a different sorts of audiences. So I think the mechanism varies widely, everything from, again, making sure that we keep our science correspondents, again, in the national press, well informed of what's happening so they understand what's happening. You saw the fantastic coverage we got for the Discovery, and that was because of a long history of talk when we had nothing exciting to report, being willing to engage with the journalist community so that the science community, they knew, what was happening. It didn't come cold. Again, so everything from that to on social media being absolutely clear, getting the message out there about what's happening, what people are doing, being willing to engage in that way through it requires, again, and we've covered this, the embedding of science throughout what we do, and a range of mechanisms are really needed to be able to do that.
One of the most imaginative things I saw was there was a cheese festival, and some astronomers took along a stand about the moon. Yes, gentleman here. Thank you.
My name is David Cole-Hamilton, and I'm president of the organisation that coordinates the work of all the chemical departments, chemical societies in Europe. And clearly this vote to leave the European community potentially has a very major effect on science. And there are going to be two sides in the negotiation. You obviously have a good route into influencing what's done on this side of the channel. Do you have ways of getting into the people who are going to be negotiating from the European side?
That's an interesting question. I mean, and I know actually, perhaps Jocelyn might even like to say some words about the links that the Royal Society of Edinburgh, again, societies, national academies have had with their colleagues in Europe, again, over this issue. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I mean, again, I think it's important, again, across all the links that we have, with my science colleagues in Europe, again, talking to them to make sure they understand, again, our position here in Scotland, our wish to continually engage. I think, again, I was out in Brussels again a few weeks ago talking to members of the Commission, again, in different branches of the Commission, again, with a message that we want to engage, again, that's where Scotland sits, that Europe's important to us. In terms of the negotiations and how those are going to be done, that I think is a level at which it's difficult to know exactly what the interactions are going to be, but maintaining engagement that we have with our colleagues across the European system, I think is important in hoping that message translates into what's important for us. I think it's a difficult one.
We do have, as has already been alluded, the President of the Estonian Academy of Sciences with us tonight. Royal Society of Edinburgh has links with many international bodies and is a member of the All-European Association of Academies. So the links are very good, and I personally am in regular contact with the Turkish Academy of Sciences, which is tricky at the moment. The stacks and stacks of scientific interconnections internationally. And in fact, I think there are as many as there are formal political links. So we're already saying that scientists do a sort of kind of soft diplomacy, while the politicians do the hard diplomacy. And I'm sure regardless of what happens about Brexit, those international links between academics will remain. Yes, Ian near the front.
Could I ask a question about the sort of health of the Scottish science formation community? I'm conscious when you go to talk to universities, undergraduates, there's a lot of Scots and undergraduates, and there's international students as well, but when you meet groups of postgraduates, there doesn't seem to be many Scottish people. You know, and it's great, we get an international community here, we train them, we give them PhDs and so forth, and then they go back to where they've come from, and they spread their scientific knowledge throughout. Now, that would be fine if there were lots of Scots internationally doing PhDs, but I'm not aware, is this a problem? I mean, do we have enough Indigenous postgrads?
That's a good question. I mean, it's interesting, and I know the makeup of my own research group, I can, from personal experience, know has changed from being almost entirely Scottish to, you know, Venezuela, you know, North America, South America, China. I've always viewed that as a positive because it hasn't actually come at the replacement of Scottish students. Again, many of the funding sources we have for PhDs are dedicated to UK or sometimes European, but often UK students. And what we have done, I think, is increased the, I don't know the statistics, but you know, it feels like we've increased the postgrad population. I think it's interesting. I think it probably is true, though, that less people from Scotland go out to do their PhD studies abroad. But there are sometimes good reasons for that. So we are fortunate in the UK. Our PhD length is typically between 3 and 4 years, 3.5 years of that duration. If you want to go to the US, it's often longer. It's 5.5 or 6 years. So what you often find is, of course, the students do Scottish PhDs here, but then they go out at the postdoc stage. I was out in Canada a couple of weeks ago and met someone again who was a Scottish undergraduate. Actually, I think she's English, but she did her undergraduate in Scotland, PhD in England, and was doing a postdoc in Canada. And I was a bit taken aback because she was the same stage of one of my students who's just finishing. But there's an attractiveness about the length of the UK PhD that, again, sometimes it is that perhaps both attracts people in but keeps some of our people here. But then at the next stage, at the postdoc stage, I think they often at that point take the opportunity to go out. I think the mix, though, is incredibly healthy for us to have that international mix at the PhD student stage.
Yes, here.
Talking a level down, when I was at school, I think I was offered 1 year science, and then it was a decision as to physics and chemistry or languages. So I don't know if the situation has changed all that much, and you had to make that decision quite early in life at sort of 13 or 14. So if you want, and I remember getting 100% in the 12, first year or whatever, but that was obviously didn't appeal to me. But if you are going to get more girls involved or more students, then surely I'd like to know if the situation has improved in terms of getting more exposure as to whether you like the subject. And the second question was, would it not be easier for the public? I find it difficult when you're talking about gravitational waves, sure, and then you're talking about all of the spin-offs. Yes. It's like going from A to Z. Yes. And I know you can't explain it exactly, but I think if you were able to sure, sort of do A to E or F, yes, to the public, it yeah, would help them understand how sandstone erodes, and that has been discovered, sure, because of gravitational waves.
So let me answer the second question first. So that was a time limitation tonight. I could not have been happier to be given a whole hour to explain to you about the technology that we developed and how the different aspects of that translate. I think there's a really interesting talk to be given on that to show how the fundamental technology that was necessary for the detection turns into that spectrum of applications. No one has ever asked me to give that talk, and it's one I would really look forward to giving, is explaining that. You're right, I just went from, because I only had a short time, we developed the technology, here's the spin-offs. It's a fantastic story, actually, to trace through where all that comes from, and that's a whole different talk. In terms of science, I think you're right. Forcing people to choose is a difficult thing. Again, even at university, people actually carry science through till they get to university, and kind of interests in physics and music. Actually, was a case that in Glasgow we often found that we found a way to let people study both. Again, that was a surprising combination that we found a way to do. So that making that choice, you know, usually has to happen somewhere. I do think giving people the flexibility to retain an interest in it as long as possible is important. And again, and find ways to do that, I think is important. I know, actually, I can see Jim Huff sitting behind you there, who I know has...
Scotland is better because of the
Yeah.
curriculum for excellence. You know,
It's
which,
broader.
I mean, the first 3 years,
Yeah.
you're kind of doing, you know, all the sciences. So decisions are later.
Yeah.
I mean, but it is.
But
an
it's still
issue.
there, and
It's
it, you know, in the end, it often doesn't go away, and it's got to happen at some point. But taking people with us as long as possible, I think, is important. Even if people then don't, in the end, carry on professionally, and I alluded to this slightly at the back of my talk, is that I think some knowledge of science at any level is incredibly important, even if it's, again, somewhere in secondary school people stop, because the confidence that people have from, again, just a little bit of knowledge in science, I think changes how people view a whole range of things later in life, to have just even a little bit of scientific knowledge. So we end up having to make the choice somewhere. Like you, I think the longer we can keep it, the better. But any interaction with science, I think, is of benefit to people.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time, I regret to say. Could I call on the chairman of CaSE, Professor Graham Reid, to come and do a vote of thanks?
Dame Jocelyn, thank you. It's difficult to imagine a more critical time for science and government to have a healthy relationship. And that relationship keeps changing because science keeps evolving, public attitudes keep evolving, and government keeps evolving. And in Scotland, that evolution has taken the form of devolution, which has given a long, distinctive nation even greater distinctiveness. And CaSE has had a strong membership in Scotland for a long time. We've had the universities of Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, Heriot-Watt, St Andrews and Strathclyde in the CaSE membership for longer than I can remember. And when the Royal Society of Edinburgh chose to join as well, for me, that provided an enormous range of new opportunities for CaSE to open up its representation of science in Holyrood in a stronger way, mirroring a long-standing representation of science in Westminster. I think tonight, Sheila Rowan has given us an enormously impressive glimpse into the world that she is now settling into, and given us cause for a lot of confidence that she is going to be an important and effective interface between government and science, both in Scotland, but also more widely, as she's described. Now, tonight wouldn't have been possible without lots of people putting in lots of work. But I'm going to highlight just a few. So, first of all, I would like to thank Ken MacDonald, Sarah Main, and Jocelyn Bell-Burnell for giving us such a good and varied evening. And I'd like to thank the staff of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the staff of CaSE, who together have done so much to think through the organisation of this evening. And then finally, I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Sheila Rowan and to join me in wishing her every success during her time as Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland.